Earlier this year, Capcom held the Capcom Super Elections, which was a massive fan poll to celebrate the company's 40th anniversary. The poll featured 10 questions regarding Capcom and their games, like which of their games are your favorite and what do you think about Capcom as a game developer and etc. And back in June of this year, they finally unveiled the result of the fan poll, where fans around the world were able to participate. And the result was pretty interesting to see, especially the differences in answers between the Japanese fans and fans from the rest of the world. They also provided a breakdown of responses by genders and age demographics, so you can see what games resonated amongst them. You can see the full result here on their website, which I've put the URL in the description down below. But one game stood out to me throughout seeing the result. It was Dino Crisis. It got second place for the Capcom games that fans liked the best, and it was the most requested game that fans want to see a sequel or a new game of, like perhaps even a remake of it. Seeing the game there was really surprising to me. I loved the game, but my impression of it was that it wasn't as popular as Resident Evil and some other Capcom games here in the list. It was definitely a pleasant surprise seeing how much fans loved the game and how highly rated it is to them, especially from the older fans and gamers outside of Japan. Of course, there might be some bias here with their answers, where fans tried to pick this game for the majority of the poll in the hopes of riling up interest and for Capcom to take notice of it, prompting them to revive the franchise. After all, it's been dormant for God knows how long now, so I do think it's the perfect time for them to revisit the series and even try to remake the first game. But let's talk about the original Dino Crisis first. Now, for those who don't know, Dino Crisis in simple terms is basically Resident Evil with dinosaurs. With the company and the director of the game, Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, was notably inspired by Jurassic Park and its sequel. It also helped with how popular the movies were at the time. So when the time came around for them to make a new game, they decided to make a new horror game, but instead of zombies this time around, they went with dinosaurs. It was also during the time when the survival horror genre was very popular. You'll find other game companies try to have their own survival horror games and even Resident Evil clones. For this game then, it was marketed as what they will call it, panic horror, to differentiate itself from Resident Evil's survival horror tag. But that's just semantics. Both games still feel very similar to each other, and it was also regarded as a spiritual successor to Resident Evil, though having dinos instead of zombies this time around. In concept and paper do sounded a lot more fun and interesting in what they can do creatively for the game. Perhaps they can even induce a different kind of fear, one that terrorizes the player when they play the game and even make them panic, like as the name Panic Horror suggests. After all, dinosaurs are supposedly more agile, smarter, and stronger than zombies. And in this game, they soak up a lot of bullets. Now for minor spoilers. The game takes place on Ibis Island. It's a small island with a research facility built there. You play as a character named Regina, part of a special force crew that is being sent to the island to investigate and capture Dr. Kirk. Upon arriving there, the place seems deserted with some corpses lying around. You found out that the place is overrun by dinosaurs because of a space-time reason, caused by the third energy research on the island. Yeah, this part of the story isn't the best. So you'll have to navigate through the facility, killing and avoiding any dinosaurs, complete your mission to capture Dr. Kirk, and find a way to escape from the island. There was a huge potential with what they can do and bring to the game, that I feel like it could have even surpassed the Resident Evil games. But in the end though, what we got is a great and charming game with plenty of flaws that stops it from truly reaching the potential that it had and could have been. On a technical level, however, this game is very impressive, especially back in the day in its time. The environment and levels are fully rendered 3D models instead of the usual pre-rendered background, which would pave the way for Capcom with Code Veronica. The lighting and the camera work in this game are exceptional too. The 3D background just pops more with the environment also looking more consistent with the game's visuals. It made the atmosphere feel more eerie and more unsettling. I feel like this has to be one of the things that this game did better than the Resident Evil games. After the first game, they made some sequels, though they went with a more action for the gameplay direction instead of sticking to its horror roots, which might irk some people, but at the same time, The sequel, Dino Crisis 2, was a really fun game. The gameplay is much more smoother and killing any dinosaurs on the screen were more fun to do than the first game since they aren't health sponges here. A comparison that I like to make for the Dino Crisis games is to compare them to the Alien franchise. The first Dino Crisis game is like Alien, in that they're more inclined towards its horror elements. Dino Crisis 2 is just like Aliens, blending fun and action that still has its horror identity there. And Dino Crisis 3 is just like Alien 3, in that we don't talk about them. All of this, I guess, is why it became their most requested game that fans want to see a return of, where Capcom could fix a lot of issues that the original game had, and they can totally revamp the game and improve it a lot, to reach the full potential that the original game had that was just hampered down with the technical limitation of its time. With a remake, they can also try to reboot the series, giving it a proper treatment with clear direction of what they want the series to be, whether to keep its horror elements or go towards a more action horror, a la Resident Evil 4. So let's talk about the things that they can do and what I hope will be in a potential remake of the game. Now, firstly is the gameplay. What will the gameplay be like for a hypothetical remake of Dino Crisis? Of course, fixed cameras will be great, right? I would love it, especially if it can keep a lot of the great camera work and angles that the original game had. But we know by now that they will probably just go with an over-the-shoulder camera since they can just use the gameplay template from the more recent RE remakes, with some adjustments here and there to the gameplay so that it can work well with faster moving dinosaur enemies instead of zombies. Perhaps like faster movements, for example. Oof, and also fix the inventory system. What the original game had was a bit of a mess. But of course, one of the main concerns with over-the-shoulder cameras is whether they can preserve the atmosphere of the original game, since a lot of it did come with how they designed those camera angles for a lot of the areas in the game. But I'm sure they can keep some aspect of it, especially seeing how the RE2 remake came out to be. But what I want them to do is to try to surpass that and make the atmosphere much more tense, which they can do by totally improving how dinosaurs work in the game. Technical limitations did affect how they wanted the original game to play like, especially with the dinosaurs in the game. The gameplay did take a lot from how Resident Evil plays like, but the issue there is that the gameplay there was designed with more zombies in mind and not dinosaurs. So what early on in the game were pretty scary encounters, especially with how tanky they are, became much more of a nuisance than an actual terrifying threat later on in the game. So making them more of an actual threat this time around, like making them much smarter and unpredictable like how the Xenomorph in Alien Isolation is like, can make the whole thing feel awesome and scarier. Like that sounded much more interesting and terrifying than zombies if you ask me. They can also add more variety of dinosaurs in the game, so that there can be different ways on how to fight them or different mechanics on how they'll try to approach and hunt you down. This way, the game won't get too stale and also just more dinosaurs is cool. Oh yeah, and not to forget, they can also be more accurate with the depiction of the dinosaurs this time around, like adding some feathers to the raptors. With better dinosaur AI and better gameplay, they then can fix some set pieces and boss fights, especially with the T-Rex. The original didn't have any proper boss fights and the T-Rex was mostly relegated to short set pieces. Maybe they can do a bit more with him this time around, like having one solid boss fight with it, which would sound amazing actually. Like imagine having to fight a T-Rex. That sounded so cool. Another thing that they can revamp has to be the level design. The original game was much more limited in that we were only playing around in a confined space that was just the research facility and its underground layers. The original did plan to have a jungle area but wasn't able to be implemented. So this time around, they can expand with the map of the game, have us explore some of the places that weren't in the original game, and add some set pieces here and there. Like imagine if they add a water level with marine dinosaurs. That sounded so cool. With a revamped map however, they can also make the level progression and puzzles feel much more natural now. In the original, they felt slightly out of place, and some puzzles didn't quite make sense why they are the way they are for a research facility. So they can make the whole thing now feel much more fitting and more natural and immersive to the location. And lastly, major spoiler warning, they can also fix and improve the story, especially with everything regarding the third energy system, with its mechanism and its placement in the story, because it kinda derails the story a bit near the end of the game. The concept of time displacement is cool and all, but I don't think it was implemented that well here, like with how the dinosaurs were transported to the present time, and why the government wants to keep it for themselves with the intention to weaponize it. I don't know, it all just doesn't come together that well, and it overcomplicates the story to a degree that it doesn't need to. They could handle it far more properly and elegantly if you ask me, if they do decide to update the story bits. They can flesh out more with the characters' motivations as well, especially with Kirk's and Gale's. Kirk's characterization was a bit of a mess, like he's supposedly the human antagonist of the story, but actually he isn't. He's just a pawn under the grand scheme of things, but like, if so, why do they need to depict him as like this villain even though he's just basically obsessed to complete his own research? It's all a mess. While they're at it, with a remake, we can totally expect a far better voice acting and performance than the one in the original.
You're not gonna believe this. He was attacked by some kind of dinosaur.
Now that's a good one. So, who was it, Barney?
What is it? Another lizard?
That's no lizard. It's a dinosaur.
Dinosaur?
So yeah, there's some ample room for them to touch up and refine the story and the lore of the game. One actual last thing though, is for them to keep the alternate costumes and the bonus game mode for the remake. Perhaps the Operation Wipeout mode can serve as a teaser to how a future remake of Dino Crisis 2 can play like. Probably. So yeah, I think rebooting the series and remaking the first game can go a long way in reviving the franchise, and also making the game better than the Resident Evil remake counterparts. If they do remake Dino Crisis properly, they can do the game justice that the original games weren't fully able to do. So in that sense, that's why a lot of people are begging Capcom to bring back Dino Crisis, to redo the game and series and cement it as potentially a game that can rival the greatest in the genre.